So, Jared, welcome. You're supposed to be in our studio, but with lockdown, we're going to do it here.
So we're going to do it. I'm in my garage. Where are you, in the living room?
I'm in our office. So we're in our office, but the studio's over there waiting for you when you get back into
the new Zoom world we live in.
So we'll look forward to that. So, Jared, congratulations on your new book. And I think it's really exciting. It so connects to what we do at Unleash Learning. So that's why I wanted to interview you. So let's jump into it.
Absolutely.
And I want you to tell us why we should stop talking as educators, facilitators, trainers to make learning stick. Why should we stop talking?
We have a tendency, and it's not so much all teachers, it's more how people think about teaching outside of the classroom, but that if I can just give you information, then you're going to hold on to it. And I think if Google has taught us anything, it's that access to information is very different than knowing, learning, and understanding information. I can look things up all day, but that hasn't changed my thinking, my creativity, my abilities one bit. So this is what we do through this book is we kind of come in and say, all right, what are some principles of learning so we can move beyond just information exchange and say, all right, if I do have information to give you, here's ways we can use to make sure that you're playing with it, that it's resonating with the way the brain naturally works so that it can stick in there a ton easier than just, here's an idea, why don't you remember it?
Because we keep saying, if we're just delivering information, we can get replaced because anybody can deliver information. But if we can get to stick, we can make the impact, and our business or school might stick around in this current environment. So,
and that's interesting when you look at the learning trajectory. I'm just writing a chapter on this morning. So people move through different levels of learning. So we typically just easy say you start at your surface, you move through 3 levels of deep, and then you kind of have this issue of transfer at the base. Mm-hmm. At the surface, when it's just pure information exchange and memorization, you're 100% right. A computer can adapt to what kids, did they get the right answer, wrong answer? Let me tweak it this way. Much easier than humans can. But once you move into those deep levels, that's the kind of stuff that computers have no clue what we mean by deep conceptualization. And so once if all we wanted to do was, here's a number, can you give it back to me? Then bad news, we're out of the job. But thank goodness we're all doing a lot more than that.
Thank goodness. Well, that brings the next question, because we've talked about this we had you on Unleash Learning TV, I think last year, but we've talked about, I'd like you to tell us the difference between short-term memory and long-term memory. How do you think about that?
It's interesting. You've got these, and the terms are thrown around a lot. So just the easiest way to kind of think about it is your brain's got input and then it's got storage. So anything we're talking about input, we're going to call short-term memory. So if you've ever heard the term working memory, sensory memory, even conscious memory, these are all the same thing. We're talking about, what are you thinking about? What are you taking in the moment right now? Long-term memory are those things that are just hanging out back here, and at any time you want, you can access it and pull it up. So by definition, long-term memory takes at least 1 night of sleep to consolidate those memories back. So you can say, whatever you're doing today, that's your short-term. Whatever you learned before today, that's going to be in your long-term. And the way these two kind of then play off of each other is the more information you have in your long-term memory, the more you can play in your short-term memory. You have more tools or Lego. Like if you think of every memory like a Lego block, you simply just have more Legos that you get to play with in your short-term memory. So the two really feed off of one another.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. So because I think there's a difference between that short-term memory, we talked about this, of just kind of getting input in rather than getting learning to stick, where it's really with somebody for long periods of time. I like the term transformative learning or liberatory learning, where it's really part of somebody and they can use it forever. So that comes to the next question I've got, because you talk about it in the book, and there's so much about the book I could talk about. Can you tell us why you think people should take notes, or our learners, with paper and pen rather than typing on a computer or on our tablets or whatever?
That's awesome. And that's a really good distinction too between input and actual thinking. So when you take notes, there are kind of 2 different flavors of notes you can take. One we'll call shallow, one we'll call deep. Now, shallow notes are when you just take dictation. It's verbatim. I hear a word, I write a word. I hear a word, I write. So think about like a stenographer in a courtroom. The problem is when you're taking shallow notes like that, the only thing of importance is the sound and the order of the words. So you just make sure that you got the right syllables down in the right context or the right order. Cool. When you take shallow notes, because the only thing that matters is the sound, afterwards, I do this all the time with my kids at uni. If I see someone doing shallow notes, I go up and say, what did you learn today? And they'll say, I don't know, I got to go read my notes. They will flat out admit they didn't learn a thing. They're going to go teach themselves later. So deep notes, on the other hand, that's where you take notes on meaning, on linkages, on purposes, on identities. How do things actually fit together? What's the bigger story? Now, the problem, so it's when you take a notes on a computer, the problem becomes one of speed. So I speak at about 120 words per minute. A lot of kids out there can type about 100 to 120 words per minute, which means their natural inclination is to try and take surface notes. Let me get as much information down as I can, which, as we saw, means they didn't learn a thing. They would be better off literally either shutting down and just listening or going home and reading the slides later, because they're just wasting an hour of time. But if you take notes by hand, there's not a human being in the world that can keep up with the way I can speak by using a pen and paper. So by definition, you already have to start taking deep notes. You have to start thinking about, what does that mean? What are the key bits? And that's why handwritten notes, like notes on a computer, are just line and line and line of text. Notes by hand are circles, are lines, are stars, are arrows. And that just shows you're already processing the meaning. So even if you change nothing else, if we just say you want to take notes, you're doing it by hand. That is one way to ensure there's a little more engagement and that deeper processing is occurring.
We talk this idea about lifting the weights. So my way of thinking about this is it gets them to lift the weights in much deeper ways. And it actually slows them down to be thinking about the weights they're actually lifting. That's
And I love that concept too. It's I think a lot of people hope that learning is going to be easy, that what's my effortless way to, I just watched a TED talk where someone's like, here's some pills. You're going to be a genius if you take this pill. No, you're not. At the end of the day, learning is effort. The more effort you put into it, the more learning you do. You try and shortcut or circumvent any of the actual thinking and watch when you pass a test the next day, but then 3 days later, you're like, I don't remember what the heck I studied. So it's lifting the weights.
And we've got, for the people who follow us, we might put a link. We have an episode about how to use the notes once they've taken the notes that really gets it to stick for everybody. So we'll put a link to that will help as well. Okay, here's another thing I loved in the book. Like, I can go on about this book, but I want to talk about multitasking, because you said we think we can, but we really can't. And my concern is that we're a lot of online learning going on right now, which means it's easy for learners to be multitasking because there's all this stuff here. So why should we be limiting or trying to limit multitasking if we want learning to stick?
So I'll start with the computer thing. The computer thing is interesting. If you look at the stats, so before this year, teenagers spent on average 2,200 hours a year on a computer. Which, just to put that into context, if you slept 6 hours a night every night, that's 2,100 hours. So they were on a computer more than they were sleeping. Cool. Now, of that 2,200 hours, only 200 was spent learning. 2,000 of those hours are spent flitting between rapidly shifting media content. So when you sit a kid down to learn in front of a computer, they've got thousands of hours of practice telling them that, oh, a computer, time to open Zoom, time to open Netflix, time to open Twitter. And so it's not that a lot of people think, oh, kids lack control. It's like, no. We've already lost with this tool. They already have a way to use this. And now we're trying to shoehorn in learning. So this idea of jumping between things, this multitasking that computers beg us to do, the reason why it's so horrible is, and I won't go too deep into the mechanisms, but whenever you're attending to something, you have to set up what's called your attentional filter. And that determines, so the world, there's a ton of things getting into your brain. But when you set your attention, okay, I'm going to focus on washing this window, the filter then determines what actually makes it into your conscious awareness and what gets blocked out so you don't have to worry about processing it. Problem is, you've only got one attention filter slot in your brain. So the most you can ever do is one focused task at a time. When you're multitasking, you're never doing two things at once. You're just really quickly jumping back and forth. And every time you do, you have to take out that filter and put in the different one. Oh, washing the window, cooking dinner, sending an email. You just have to keep moving it. Every time you switch your filter, your brain turns off for about 0.2 seconds. So you start to go slower. In addition, all these rule sets, the more you jump, start to bleed, and your memory just starts to say, none of this makes sense, and it starts to just throw information out. So you start to remember less. In a very real sense, and this is one of the hardest rules we've ever learned of learning, when you multitask, you go slower, your accuracy drops, and your memory decreases significantly. Probably the single worst thing we can do for learning is multitasking. Focused attention is everything. So if we're on a computer, how do we get everything locked except for the one thing we want them doing? That's one of the hardest questions, but one of the most important things we got to ask.
Well, this is what we say unleash learning, but I don't know if this comes from someplace else. So I hope we're not stealing it, but we always say where the attention goes, the learning flows.
I
So
love
where
it.
the attention goes, the learning flows. And the other thing we talk about is we've got to control the weightlifting. So
Yeah.
there's ways to be really strategic about how we control, like how we conduct the weightlifting, because where the attention goes, the learning flows. So
And that's a perfect example of guidance. So yeah, the way we always say it is attention is your gateway to learning, but I like yours. Yours is easier to remember. But then a lot of people get worried about, oh, if I put attention here, then everyone is locked in. It's like, no, that's the point of teaching is guidance. If you let kids, there is a time, don't get me wrong, there are definitely times when you cut the cord and say, okay, go show me what you got. But if you're at the learning stages, those primary stages where no one's ready to show you what they got, then we're definitely the ones who need to be guiding that attention to the right things. As an interesting aside, I know we're kind of running low on time, but is to really set that home. A lot of digital products are engaging, but they forget your rule that where attention goes, learning flows. So think of something like when we were growing up, we used to play Oregon Trail all the time. Now I played hours and hours and hours of that game. Enjoyable, engaging as heck. Problem is you're focused on the wrong thing. You're focused on hunting game, fording rivers, and dying of dysentery. Little did I know, I only knew about 2 years ago that was meant to teach us history. That was meant to teach us about the Oregon Trail and all the states it went through and I'm almost a 40-year-old man. The only thing I know about the Oregon Trail is that it ended in Oregon and that I never quite got there. So it was engaging.
Sorry, I'm interrupting you. Perfect example.
It drove my attention, but it drove it to the wrong thing. So get it focused on the right things that you want them learning.
Well, it brings us to our last question, because what I want to ask you is for people who are really all online right now, because a lot of schools are completely online, what are your recommendations to get learning to stick? You know, we've talked about multitasking. We've talked about taking paper and pen notes. We've talked about how learning happens, the ways you're describing that. So are there a couple of recommendations if we want learning to stick? Because technology is just a tool.
Boom. So I'd say there's probably three big things. One, so in addition to everything we've talked about with multitasking, one is don't mix text with speech. Because at the end of the day, so Zoom is very personal like this, but the rest of the computer is still 90 to 95% text-based. And unfortunately, students can't read while listening to somebody speak at the same time. The brain can't handle it, so it becomes multitasking. They'll read a little, listen a little, read a little, listen a little, and then lose a lot from everything. So if you're going online, either teach or read, but don't try and mix those two together. Two, I would say kind of memory is predicated on recall, and this is lifting the weights. The more you access information from your own brain, the deeper that memory becomes. Unfortunately, computers aren't great for recall. They're really good at disseminating information, which is why I don't remember my cell phone number. It gives it to me, and it doesn't require me to ever do anything with it. So when it comes time to start locking down memories, try to step away from the computer. Find ways to get them doing things live over here, whether that's they're going to teach their parents something or they're going to transcribe their notes in a new way, anything offline to get them pulling out information just because the computer is not good at it. And then I think kind of the third thing then goes back to that multitasking and attention thing. Don't mistake engagement for enjoyment. So just because we're online, people think, oh, kids can't pay attention. No, they're fine. The attention span is still there. If a kid can play video games for 10 hours, they're fine. It's just we've got to ensure that we're giving them something to pay attention to. So we've got to be riding their attention, riding their learning, and making sure that they're going in the right direction so we don't just lose them to all the other fun bells and whistles on this machine. So those are kind of the three bits, but
I was grabbing our coffee cups because I just happen to have them on the desk, but this is what you're saying, it's all about, it really is about the kinds of there's a certain kind of engagement that makes learning stick. Yeah. Not all engagement's the same, and we have to control the kind of engagement. That's where the attention flows discussion that we were talking about.
And you can assume if it works live, it's going to work online. So narrative, always a good idea. Finding emotions, always a great idea. Anything that works live is still going to work online. So take that pedagogy, bring those principles here, and you might just have to tweak it a bit because we're in a garage instead of live.
Okay, well, let's do this. We wanted to stick for the audience. So as always, with a question for the audience. So here's for the people watching right now. What we mentioned is Jared's new book is out. I cannot recommend the book enough. So Jared has given us a couple extra copies. So this is what we're going to do. The question we've got for you is this. We want to know, what is your one action you're thinking to take that you think will make learning stick for everyone from what Jared's talking about? So some of the best conversations take place after the episode. So jump over there. And what we're going to do is someone from the team will pick the best response, and we will mail you a copy of Jared's book anywhere you are in the world. So hopefully that's going to help get the word out for your incredible book, Jared.
Thank you. And good luck to all participants.
All participants. So Jared, thank you so much. When the lockdown's over, you're coming back to the studio because there's more I want to ask you about PowerPoint. I want to ask you about emotion. I want to ask you about all this stuff. So we'll welcome you back. Thank you for the work you're doing out there.
No, thank you. And keep up the good work.
Thank you. And for everybody listening, thank you for the work you're doing for the world. We are cheering you on, and we'll see you in the next episode. We'll see you soon.
Bye, y'all.
Bye, everybody.